Welcome to the Freak Show, fellow freaks.
I'm Matthew Brockmeyer.
And I'm Christa Carmen.
And this is
Murder Coaster.
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Strap in and let's take a ride into the Emerald Triangle of Northern California, my own backyard, with a tale of pot-growing hippies gone terribly, terribly astray. A tale that coincided with the downfall of a weird but beautiful and thriving culture. And today's episode is a request from a listener, so thank you so much, Rowan, for listening and requesting this tragic tale. We hope you enjoy it.
Let's begin. Prologue. 420 in Laytonville, California. It was 4:20 in the afternoon, an iconic time in Northern California, when potheads would gather to smoke weed. But on November 11th, 2016, in the tiny town of Laytonville, it wasn't a time for bliss and stoner contentment. Instead, a murder was being reported.
A crowd was gathering at the rundown cottage motel, where Route 101 sliced through the tiny town of Laytonville, as James, a dreadlocked hippie in dirty overalls who worked in the hills growing weed, told sheriff's deputies how he'd found the body of his boss, Jesus Jeff, in a dilapidated cabin with his throat cut and covered in stab wounds.
James told the deputies gathering in the misty rain,
"Oh, it was dark, man, and I shined my flashlight in, and then I saw Jeff with everything fucked up. Everything fucked up, man. So fucked up."
Deputies asked James if he could take them up into the hills and show him where the body is. But James shook his head, his long blonde dreadlocks cascading down around his face, his voice cracking as he says,
I don't want to go back up there, man. The look in his eyes, the look in his dead eyes, that stare, it creeped me the fuck out, dude.
Then an old man hobbled up, saying,
"I'll take you up there. It's my land. I own it."
The old man was named Louis Baglier, a disabled combat veteran with long, scraggly gray hair, who'd been renting the land to the hippie pot grower everyone called Jesus Jeff.
Louis Baglier climbs into the back of a sheriff's car, and they take off up Highway 101, through the town of Laytonville, and up to Black Oak Ranch, where the famous hippie commune, the Hog Farm, is located. Then they go down a dirt road, over a wooden bridge, and up switchbacks, through several locked gates, miles into the hills, tall fir trees draping the land in shadows.
Louis directed police through the maze of dirt roads, up to a tiny ramshackle cabin they called the Engine House. The land was trashed. There was garbage everywhere. Children's toys, a refrigerator turned on its side, a broken-down RV covered in graffiti, a garage structure covered in tattered industrial plastic, and from the tree limbs hung recently harvested pot plants.
Trying to dry weed by hanging it from tree branches in November is a sad sign of desperation right there.
In the tiny cabin, just a shack really, they find the body of Jeff Settler, 35, wrapped in a bloody sleeping bag. He had defensive wounds on his forearms and hands. Blood was everywhere. His throat had been deeply slashed with, quote, severe damage to the neck, end quote, and there was a clump of hair in his left hand.
To the sheriffs, it looked personal, as if this was retribution.
When they begin to question the old man about all the weed everywhere, He starts to weep, saying he doesn't know anything about it, then starts mumbling through his tears.
Oh, Jeff. Oh, Jeff. I just celebrated my 70th birthday with him. Oh, and now this.
Meanwhile, back at the cottage motel, James is telling deputies a harrowing story.
James tells them how he'd been working for Jesus Jeff, trimming weed. That night, they'd sat around a campfire with Jeff and other workers, merrily drinking beers, happy to be finally finishing with the crop. Then he'd gone to sleep in the garage structure.
But in the middle of the night, he'd been awakened when the door swung open and a figure stared in at him. It was a former worker named Giggles who'd been kicked off the land.
What's going on, dude? James asked.
Giggles paused before speaking. You don't want to go out there, man.
A woman's high-pitched scream then cut through the night. Dude, what the fuck is going on?
You don't want to go the fuck out there. Trust me.
James got up, went to the door, but Giggles slammed it shut, pressing himself against it. So James went to the garage door on the other end of the structure, opened it, slipping out into the night, saying it was quiet, very quiet, eerily quiet, too quiet.
Then one of the workers, Amanda, appeared and said, "Get the fuck out of here."
James says the fear in her eyes terrified him, so he took off into the hills where he had a tent, got in, zipped it up, and waited, listening as Amanda's car rumbled away. As dawn began to creep across the sky, and James felt sure there was no one there, he went back to the shack they called the engine room, where he'd heard the scream come from.
The place had been filled with totes of marijuana, which were now all gone, and as he cast his flashlight about, there was his boss, Jesus Jeff, dead, his throat slashed, drenched in blood, his lifeless eyes staring back at him.
Horrified and in an utter state of panic, James then ran out through the hills, bypassing roads, tromping through the forest of oaks and tall firs for hours, slowly making his way to Laytonville and calling the sheriffs.
The sheriffs released a statement to the press, releasing names and photos of the suspects.
I remember this day very well, going into Garberville for breakfast and getting a copy of the local newspaper, the Southern Humboldt Independent, which sadly now is gone, like so much of that time. And the headlines read, "Trimmers sought in Laytonville homicide." And there were 3 photographs. One of a really pretty girl with a ring in her septum and tattoos across her shoulders. The other, a maniacally grinning, wide-eyed dude with a mohawk. And last, a guy with a beard and sunglasses who looked like he didn't give a fuck about anything. And if the photos weren't enough to get your attention, the names were Cricket, Giggles, Amanda, and Zach. What a crew.
The Santa Rosa newspaper, the Press Democrat, stated, "A total of 7 people are now considered suspects in a case that has rattled the North Coast at the peak of the marijuana harvest, when trimmigrants flood the Emerald Triangle looking for work, separating the potent buds from pot plants."
And all of Northern California wondered just what the hell happened and who the fuck were these freaks.
Chapter 1. Jesus Jeff.
Oh, I live in the mountains. I plant my seed in the ground. I grow the good sensamia. I grow it 2,000 pounds. 1 ton of marijuana. I grow a 1 ton of marijuana. 1 ton of marijuana. I grow a 1.
Jeffrey Quinn Settler was born in 1981 In Lubbock, Texas, a very conservative and religious town, two parents, Debbie and Greg.
Jeff's dad, Greg, was a carpenter and contractor by trade. And he says Jeff was always a rebel, always different. In high school, Jeff was a punk rocker with a leather jacket and a lip piercing.
After graduating high school in 1998, Jeff ended up eating some acid and listening to the music of the Grateful Dead. And like scores of folks before him, his life was changed forever.
Jeff loved eating acid and swirling to the groovy tunes of the surviving Grateful Dead members. Fill-in Friends, Rat Dog, the Crusader Rabbit Band, hitting the festival circuit, traveling about as he danced and sang.
After getting busted for weed in Texas, a very big deal at the time, he realized the little town of Lubbock was too square for him, and he headed out to the West Coast, settling in California, where he fit right in.
Ending up in old San Francisco.
The year 2015 saw a huge burst of momentum and life in the Grateful Dead community, as it was a celebration of the band's 50th anniversary, and they were doing a tour called Fare Thee Well that was hugely popular, drawing people from all over the world.
It's kind of like when those new Star Wars movies came out. You know, Han Solo, Princess Leia, and Luke Skywalker are all in a movie together again. There's this massive rush of nostalgia. And, like it or not, the Grateful Dead have always been, and always will be, fueled by LSD. And 2015 was no different of a time. And Jeff became involved in the acid underworld. He loved acid. He could eat more of it than anybody. They say when you move up the chain in the acid dealing world, that to prove your loyalty to the family, you have to do a thumbprint, which is dipping your thumb in a pile of raw LSD crystals, a gram of which is 10,000 hits, and then popping that thumbprint onto your tongue.
That is crazy. I mean, just thinking about that makes me want to just like curl in a ball and die. I couldn't.
And I got another esoteric bit of weird acid lore for you too, and I have no idea if this one's true or not. But there's this basically urban myth that went around the Grateful Dead parking lot back in the day that these hippies were laying grams, you know, like turning crystal LSD into liquid and putting it on blotter paper and shit in a hotel room. And a cop somehow came in to investigate the smell of weed. And when he walked in, he had no idea what he was seeing. And he said, "Is this cocaine?" before licking his finger, sticking it into the crystal LSD, and tasting it. He immediately started tripping, like fell to the floor, and they were able to grab all their shit and get out of there. I have no idea if this is true, rumor or not. Anyone ever hear this story? Is this story true? Let us know at murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com.
Yeah, interested to hear. So Jeff was a real groovy guy. As they say in that world, he was hella heady, part of this Grateful Dead revival movement that included the bands Fish, Widespread Panic, Government Mule, all classic jam bands, but also bands that had a techno edge like Sector 9 and EDM. He loved to get high and dance, and he attracted people to him, which got him the name Jesus Jeff.
Jesus Jeff was also very intense, controlling, and even scary. As one close friend described him, imagine someone in the mob, but a hippie. Just like real long hair, wearing tie-dye shirts. But if you screw him over, he's gonna burn your house down. You know, that kind of vibe.
The underground hippie world, while basically capitalist, working on buying and bartering goods, be they heady burritos, patchwork hoodies, or pounds of psychedelic mushrooms, is also a living type of working anarchy. There are no real laws, but there are accepted rules you don't break. And if you do, you face consequences.
And some say Jesus Jeff used LSD as a means of testing people and bending them to his will. They also say Jesus Jeff wanted to start a cult, be a guru of acid.
Jesus Jeff then set his eye on the ultimate hippie dream, living free in the redwood forests of Northern California and growing weed. He started hanging out in northern Mendocino and southern Humboldt, the cannabis capital of the world, often referred to as the Emerald Triangle.
Chapter 2. The Emerald Triangle.
I'm an outlaw by trade, straight flush in spades. There's no need for you to know my name. My past is gone, I'm honest as the day is long. I just broke a rule or two along the way. Some laws are written.
The Emerald Triangle is a term you often hear in conjunction with the heyday of cannabis growing, a culture that sprung up and existed for over half a century, starting in the late 60s and early 70s with back-to-the-land hippies who found cheap land and clear-cut hills in far northern California, an area that covered Humboldt, Mendocino, and Trinity counties, the three counties forming a triangle, hence the term, the Emerald Triangle.
By the mid-2010s, the cannabis industry was in what's become known as the Green Rush. It all began in 1998 when Proposition 215 passed in California, legalizing cannabis for medical use.
It was a vague bill, stating only that you needed a doctor's recommendation. No, but what even is a recommendation? Say you're like golfing with your doctor and he says, "You know, Stan, you should really try marijuana." I mean, that's a recommendation, isn't it?
That's the most California example of a recommendation I've ever heard. While police carried on busting people and saying, "We'll let the judge decide what to do," a common phrase of law enforcement at the time, doctors were coming out of the woodwork, selling recommendations all day for $300 a pop. Lines going around the block.
Yeah, I got one right away. Counties tried to impose limits. The state was flustered. Legal cannabis dispensaries were popping up everywhere, selling weed. And so then President George Bush sent in the DEA to California. They headed to Santa Cruz to bust, among other people, Suzanne Fiel, a paraplegic patient suffering from post-polio syndrome. But folks in Santa Cruz were steaming pissed. They laughed in the DEA's face, lit up joints, screamed at the feds, and activists chained themselves to the DEA's vehicles and refused to let them leave. It was widely reported by the press and was a disaster for the feds, who looked like unfeeling jackboot tyrants, which, in my opinion, they were.
Unfortunately, a lot of people did go to prison during this initial crackdown.
But then, good old Barack Obama came into office and started a new policy, stating when it comes to medical marijuana, just let the states decide what to enforce and stay out of it. As he famously said to Barbara Waters, "We've got bigger fish to fry."
It was a beautiful time for anarchy. Though federally illegal, which it actually still is to this day, medical cannabis was legal in California, and the limits on how much could be grown were in crazy limbo.
Horticultural artisans set out to grow the finest cannabis possible, creating new strains like Sour Diesel and OG Kush that completely changed the market with bold, new, unique flavors unseen before. Competitions like the Cannabis Cup sprang up. A whole culture that had been swelling for decades finally came to fruition.
Towns and hamlets in the Emerald Triangle were thriving. The schools had money, the fire departments had top-of-the-line equipment, sidewalk cafes were overflowing, there were boutique clothing stores popping up, and some very industrial folks were becoming multi-millionaires overnight. Then starting up gourmet restaurants, wineries, and breweries.
This industrial boom also opened up a world of much-needed labor. Large-scale cannabis production can be very labor-intensive. There's the actual growing, transplanting, fertilizing, irrigating, constructing greenhouses. But then there's the processing, an incredibly laborious process of hand-trimming any leaf matter off the buds with these little scissors, usually involving large amounts of people, or crews, as the workers are called. This brought in a flood of freaks from all over the world looking for seasonal work, folks that became known as trimmigants.
It was a worldwide phenomenon. People from all over Europe and as far away as Australia, South America, and Japan, all converging en masse in these little backwood communities for work. Some stayed and started their own grows, leading to communities of Bulgarians and Laotians.
We always had the same French anarchist squatters come and help us every year. And the trimmigant lifestyle became part of the crusty culture. These train-hopping, gutter-punk-looking kids, and they'd gather on the corner in different towns, holding up scissors, hoping to find a job trimming, which they often did. Though it really got totally ridiculous and out of control, and people love to hate on these people.
The green rush was in full swing. There were no regulations, no permits, no fees, no nothing. All you needed was some recommendation from a doctor who was happy to give it out to anybody for $300 a pop, and you were free to legally grow weed.
And this is the world that Jesus Jeff wanted to break into and build his empire in and form his LSD cult.
Chapter 3. Laytonville, California. Laytonville, California is a tiny town right on U.S. Route 101, at the northern edge of Mendocino County, where the highway becomes a winding two-lane road through patches of redwood and gold meadows of oak. It's famous for being the home of hippie icon Wavy Gravy's commune, the Hog Farm.
The Hog Farm commune is a long heritage in the counterculture world. They actually supplied first aid at Woodstock and were famously in the documentary film, eventually becoming a fixture at Grateful Dead concerts.
The commune had started in North Hollywood back in the early 60s before moving to an actual hog farm in Tujunga, where they got their name, and eventually moved into far northern Mendocino County onto a 300-acre farm outside Laytonville called Black Oak Ranch. And they're still around today, Wavy Gravy going strong and boasting of having the world's longest-running hippie commune.
Freak power! I've been there many times for various festivals, and two of my best friends in the whole world, Twig and Harlan, were married there. Very cool wedding. Hi, Twig and Harlan. Listeners may remember we talked about the hog farm in our Leslie Van Houten series, because Wavy Gravy had told Snake Lake, who was like 15 and living on the commune with her parents, to go hang out with this groovy cat named Charlie Manson. Oops, I guess we all make mistakes. The 60s were kind of fucked up.
Ain't that the truth? But as for the town of Laytonville, there's not much to it. Blink and you'll miss it.
At that time, you roll into town and be greeted by a burger joint with a giant wooden Native American head, the Chief, which is gone now, and I guess it wasn't politically correct, but I still love their greasy roadside burgers. Then there was a few cheap motels, including the Cottage, where we began our story today, which is closed, a health food store, which is also gone, a Greasy Spoon diner, a gas station, a couple of coffee shops, hippies selling tie-dyes on the sidewalk, a grocery store that was actually tiny at the time, but has since expanded, and at the northern tip, a rough and tumble bar called Boomers.
While the town itself is tiny, the rural hills surrounding it are filled with ranches and homesteads and pot farms.
So it was in Laytonville that somehow Jesus Jeff met Lou Baglier, an elderly disabled combat veteran with a soft spot in his heart for hippies. Much of Northern California was settled in this way. The land had been heavily logged in the 50s and 60s, clear-cut until there wasn't a tree left, and it was too steep to farm or ranch, and filled with mountain lions and bobcats that would devour your livestock. Not good for much. And there'd be some old landowner with hundreds of thousands of acres of this stuff, with a soft spot in his heart for hippies. Here in Southern Humboldt, we had this guy, Bob McGee. He owned this hardware store and mill, and supposedly, if you came here in the 70s or early 80s, he'd give you 40 acres, a shovel, and a bag of pot seeds, and say, "You can pay me for the land at harvest." He'd even come out and build you a cabin. In fact, my house was built by him, a total hippie cabin, all redwood with weird windows. It's really cool.
That is very cool. While the land seemed useless to some, it was perfect for hippies who could conceal themselves in the hills, and the clear-cut meadows got sunshine all day long, perfect for growing the finest marijuana on the planet.
Absolute perfect outlaw country. All those hills where no one can see what you're up to.
So Lou brought Jesus out to some property of his, 40 acres deep in the hills of Black Oak Ranch, neighboring the far end of the iconic Hog Farm commune.
The land had no electricity, no running water, and no real structures, just dilapidated shacks. There was trash everywhere, waste and refuse left from previous growers. But there was water, which is the most important thing for agriculture production. But it came from a well that had been built by Wells Fargo in the 1800s. And it was a hike to get to, going down this rambling dirt path. But still, there was water, which may have been a deciding factor.
Lou offered to rent the place to Jesus Jeff for $2,000 a month, which is a lot of money for a place with no real house or running water. They basically just camped there. But Jesus saw it as a great opportunity. High-quality Mendocino-grown weed was still fetching a very high price with connoisseurs, and this would be the perfect place to form his tribe. So Jeff agreed.
Jeff was actually warned that Lou was a shady character. It seemed that everyone who had rented land from him befell some weird misfortune. They were robbed or ripped off. Lou gave off the vibe of a kindly old man, but he was said to have a cruel and vicious streak and was miserly. But, truth be told, Jesus Jeff doesn't appear to be an angel himself. Now, I didn't know this guy at all. As far as I know, I have never met him. But people do say he had his fair share of enemies and had been involved with some shady shit along the way.
Chapter 4. Life on the Hill. And so Jeff set to work, recruiting workers for his farm.
There was Louis Blank, a.k.a. Cricket. At 34, he was the oldest of them, a country boy from Illinois, raised on his parents' farm. He'd done a stint in the military, then ended up in Humboldt County, where he lived for years working on pot farms. So old Cricket, he knew what he was doing, and was definitely an asset to have there on the farm.
There was Gary Gibbons, aka Giggles, from Illinois as well. At 23, he was the youngest of the group, and he'd literally giggle at the end of every sentence.
Yeah, totally. There's police interview footage floating around out there of Giggles being interrogated, and it's so fucking annoying. Even when getting interviewed, he's all, yeah, ha 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 ha. Apparently, he used to hang out on the plaza in Arcata, and that may have been where Jeff met him.
There was also Kaylin, an old friend of Jeff's who would come up for the season.
And every project was an LSD trip. They would gather in a circle, and Jeff would pull out a vial of LSD and dose everyone, calling it an exercise in teamwork. Putting up a fence, fixing the road, whatever it was, became a 3-day trip. And Jesus Jeff always ate the most acid. This guy would carry around raw crystal LSD with him, as well as vials of heavily concentrated liquid.
There was a strong sense of camaraderie among the young men. They were all in it together, and at night they'd sit around the campfire, talking and laughing and drinking beers.
But of course, shit got weird. Jesus gave Giggles... I love these fucking names, dude. It's like something I would write. This whole story is like something I would write. Jesus gave Giggles $1,000 to go to town and get supplies. Dry goods and groceries, fertilizer, shovels. But when Giggles gets to town, instead, he buys an ounce of cocaine and heads to the bar. A whole ounce of cocaine. He's not fucking around. And there he hooks up with a girl, and they take off to Oregon together.
A few weeks later, he called from Oregon. Broke, no cocaine left, obviously. Said he was sorry and asked Jesus Jeff if he'd pick him up, which he did, bringing him back to the farm. But now Giggles owed Jesus, and he had to pay back his debt with work.
Then Michael Andrew Cain showed up, 27 years old. He was a dopey-looking guy with stubby blonde dreadlocks from Pleasantville, New York. He'd grown up a privileged kid with a good family, but he had learning issues that he struggled with, couldn't read very well. He got into drugs in high school, and after graduating, started going to music festivals, selling drugs to afford the lifestyle. He'd actually gotten caught trying to dump drugs into the toilet of a Greyhound bus, but then skipped bail and was on the run, hoping to hide in the hills of the Emerald Triangle. He was a raver and EDM kid, all about techno and dubstep. What's up with dubstep? You like that stuff?
No. But I may have had a gymnastics floor exercise routine that was choreographed to some dubstep back in the day.
I don't know. I kind of like it for some reason. I used to think that black metal was the most unmarketable music because it was just so whatever. But I think dubstep may be the most unmarketable music. I don't know.
Yeah, I could see that. Michael and Kaylin found an old solar panel laying in the rubbish and hooked it up to his keyboard and DJ stand so he could play EDM. Everyone dancing in the dust and garbage to the pounding of the electronic drum beat.
Then Michael invited a friend of his from New Jersey, Zach Worcester, who'd also been into the EDM and dubstep festival circuit on the East Coast. And he also had multiple drug warrants and was looking for a place to hide out. The remoteness and outlaw culture of the Emerald Triangle seemed like the perfect place.
It was a big, happy family out on the mountain. And there were others as well, like Freddie Gastel, 27, a guy with a mohawk from New Jersey, whose main asset seems to be that he had a car. And Abdirahman Mohammed, 28, from San Diego, who went by the name Richie.
But it was always weird as hell. One night, sitting around the campfire, Giggles gathered all his possessions together and threw them into the fire. He then grabbed a canister of gasoline and dumped it over his head before lunging forward towards the fire. The others leapt up and tackled him before he could reach the flames, screaming at him to stop. Chill, man. Chill. Fuck, what a bummer.
They say Jesus Jeff wanted a cult and used LSD to break people down and make them perfect workers, much like old Charlie Manson did.
And they say he had weird acid that he used on people. A strange and cursed type of LSD, allowing him to control them. But I don't think he had bad acid. Making LSD is no easy task. I seriously doubt this guy was actually manufacturing the stuff. He most likely just knew where to buy it in bulk as raw crystal in San Francisco. And I don't think when you buy acid, you can say, I want the stuff the cult leaders use to brainwash their followers and make them feel all weird. He was just using and giving out what the chemists were putting out at that time, which I actually heard was really, really good. Because the internet underground chemists were able to get ingredients that were very difficult to obtain in the late 90s and early 2000s. I distinctly remember folks in the Northern California area saying the acid going around was really good, but I myself didn't ingest any. Once you've crossed the river, you no longer need the boat.
Chapter 5, Lord of the Flies. Then, one day, they're all gathered in the little cabin, and Jesus Jeff is sitting in a chair in the corner, very quiet, just sitting there, when he leaps up and begins screaming, accusing everyone of trying to take over his land, cutting him out of his hill, saying, I know hell's angels. I'll have them come up here and kill all of you. You'll all be dead. Now get out. Get the fuck off my land. Get the fuck out.
So they all left, grabbed their shit and took off. Eventually, most of them came back, apparently just carrying it on and acting like the incident never happened. But now things have just gotten so weird. As Kaylin would say, it was like Lord of the Flies out there, man.
Michael was gone by this point, but his friend Zach was still sticking around. Others were coming and going as well. James, with the long blonde dreadlocks and overalls, joins the crew at some point.
As harvest begins, they're bringing in early strains, as well as any branches that might have broken off, and anything that looks like it might mold. And trimming is starting up, so they're starting to get desperate for trimmers.
So they found some trimmigrants, this guy Aaron and his girlfriend Amanda, and her 4-year-old son. Amanda is a pretty hippie girl with a septum ring and tattoos across her shoulders, with playful eyes and a very sweet smile.
Now this place was a total sausage fest. All these dudes up on the hill, and when a pretty girl comes on the scene, it just adds another layer of weird to the dynamic.
Jesus Jeff is immediately flirting with Amanda, laying on the charm, boldly checking her out, to the point that Aaron had to say to him,
Yo, Jeff, what are you doing? You know we don't roll like that. We're not those kind of hippies. It's fucking hilarious.
Amanda seemed to like it and was flirting back. Jeff started taking Amanda off and they'd get drunk together in town, showing up hungover in the morning. Aaron finally had had enough, told Amanda they had to leave, that it was too weird, he couldn't take it. And she said, go ahead, but I'm staying.
Aaron would later say that both Jeff and Zach were sleeping with Amanda. Free love. It's looking more and more like the Charlie Manson family every minute.
So Aaron's out. There's some crazy love triangle going on. They're all high out of their minds on acid. Giggles is trying to set himself on fire. No one's been paid. They were broke, groveling for food, beer, cigarettes, living in utter squalor, no hot water, no shower at all. Jesus owed each of them thousands of dollars and kept promising he'd pay them as soon as he pulled off the next deal, which never seemed to happen.
Which is extremely typical for that time, unfortunately. And they're working their asses off all day in the hot sun. Cutting down plants, hauling them in, stripping them down of all the fan leaves, breaking off the branches and hanging each one, running out of space and converting new structures into drying sheds. They build this huge hoop house to dry plants in. A hoop house is like a long spine of bent PVC pipes that they cover in tarps. Hoop houses are like really common on weed farms. Usually they're used as greenhouses for light deprivation. And they can be as sturdy and reinforced as you want them to be. or as flimsy and ramshackle as you let them be.
Break free from the ordinary and check out a podcast with thought-shattering concepts that will reshape the way you interpret the world.
We are the Swerve Podcast, and our mission is very simple. Each episode, we research and discuss topics that swerve off the mainstream path in an attempt to understand everything in the universe, one obscure topic at a time.
Whether you're into forgotten history, cutting-edge science, strange frontiers of the unknown, or just need a good laugh in an uncensored way, the Swerve Podcast has you covered.
Listen to the Swerve Podcast today on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or any other major platforms.
Chapter 6. The Rain. Then the forecast called for rain, and a whole new panic gripped the little compound. For rain can be a terrible thing for weed, and is one of the biggest fears of a farmer with a beautiful crop ready to harvest.
Northern California is ideal for both grapes and cannabis because of the Mediterranean climate. The summers are bone dry. There's often absolutely no rain at all for months in the summer. And it's a very dry heat, no humidity. Perfect for growing grapes and weed, which Northern California is world famous for.
In years when the first fall rains come late, those are the best vintage. Those are the years you're looking for when choosing wines. Those are the years farmers hope for, and when the rains come, they come hard, a deluge.
Once a flowering marijuana plant gets soaked in rain and blown in the wind, they're never the same. The shock kind of stuns them, and even though the sun can come out later and there's clear skies, the earth itself has absorbed the first heavy rain. It's seeped into everything, and everything starts to rot and mold. And mold is a cannabis farmer's worst nightmare. It can decimate an entire crop overnight.
Black clouds began to fill the skies, the wind picking up, bringing an autumn chill, and the first pattering of rain fell on the land. They needed to bring every plant they could inside.
So at dawn, like every other project they took on, they gathered around and Jesus Jeff dosed each of them with a heavy amount of good old LSD, and they got to work, harvesting and stripping the plants down, hanging them up anywhere they could, working all day in the rain which began to fall harder as the sun dipped below the horizon. As night fell on them, they put on headlamps and continued working in the darkness.
The wind is whipping, and it's absolutely pouring now, rain falling in sheets, what they call an atmospheric river, just dumping, and they're sloshing through the mud, and in the darkness and their LSD haze, they fail to notice that the big old hoop house they'd built out of PVC is beginning to collect water. The tarp sinking between the ribs and filling with ponds of water until the structure couldn't take the weight, and whoosh, the entire thing just flattened under the weight of all that water.
We call that the pancake. We've had it happen to us when we were using hoop houses as greenhouses. All the spines, they just bend over at once, and the thing just goes completely flat as a pancake.
Now all of their best weed, the big money crop, is lying in the mud, drenched in water, completely flattened. Everything they'd worked, sweated, labored, and fretted over, dedicated themselves to, stressed over, lost their minds over. Over 100 pounds of cannabis, worth nearly $250,000.
Even getting to it was difficult, as the tarps laying on top of the weed were just filled with heavy ponds of water.
Jesus Jeff fell to his knees, weeping. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a bottle of LSD wash, the most highly concentrated vial, each drop about 10 normal hits, and squirts it down his throat.
One of the workers exclaims in wonder, "Whoa, dude! That's the most amount of acid I've ever seen anyone take."
Chapter 7. Party Night.
What would people that know me think of me if they had a glimpse into reality? When I stare at each and every day.
Once they'd done all they could salvaging the crop, hanging it and wet trimming it for days on end, eventually somehow getting it dry, and honestly, I really don't know how these jokers were even getting their weed dry. Most growers have big dry sheds with industrial dehumidifiers, fans, heaters. Proper drying and curing of cannabis is absolutely crucial if you want top quality. But Jesus Jeff and his crew somehow got all their weed dry and trimmed and did end up with over 100 pounds of finished product. Hacked it all up in yellow and black totes.
So Jesus Jeff gave Giggles, Cricket, Zach, and Freddie $500 each and told them to go to town, get a room, take showers, and he'd let them know when he was ready for them to come back. And most importantly, when he was ready to pay them. And they all piled into Freddie's car and drove off, up Highway 1 into the Redwoods, past Leggett and the famous drive-through tree, through Piercy, once home to reggae on the river, out of Mendocino and into Humboldt County, to the town of Garberville, where they got a room in a cheap motel and waited, taking their first hot shower in months.
Good old Garberville, my old-time stomping ground. Garberville was hopping in the fall of 2016. I remember it well. I actually remember that rainstorm very well. It was intense. Bars and restaurants were packed. There was this great New Orleans bistro called Cecil's, where you could get deep-fried oysters, Cajun catfish, and piles of crawdads, as well as local wines like the famous Bryceland Pinot Noir. There would be music playing, and there was a brand new town square that had just been built where a thriving farmers market will be held every Friday. It was a golden time, but it was all about the change.
Then word gets to the workers that Jesus Jeff didn't want them coming back, which came as a shock, especially as they'd left their belongings there. They got a bottle of vodka and proceeded to get wasted, fuming, angry, everyone talking shit about Jesus Jeff. At some point, they all eat acid. Now they're drunk and tripping, filled with anger and rage.
They wander out into the streets of Garberville, where they buy some Valium from a vagrant. So now they're tripping, drunk on vodka, and high on Valium. And this is when the talk of killing starts.
At first, it seems like a drunken boast. Zach saying,
"If Jesus Jeff doesn't pay me, I swear to God I'll fucking kill him."
The others soon joined in, saying, "Yeah, fuck him! Kill him!"
They start calling and texting Jesus Jeff, demanding to get paid, but he doesn't answer the phone or reply to their texts. They go to the Branding Iron, a Wild West bar with a weird mixture of rednecks and hippies, where my sister-in-law was actually the bartender at that time. I asked her about these guys, if she remembered them or anything. She said she didn't, that there was a lot going on. Hi, Amanda.
It was a crazy night, as it was November 8th, the day of the elections, and word was soon going through the barroom that Hillary Clinton conceded and had called Donald Trump to congratulate him on his win.
The word also went out that Proposition 64 had passed, which legalized cannabis for recreational use in California. And little did anyone realize it, but this was going to change everything forever. It was the last hurrah. Within a few years, the weed market would completely crash. The price of cannabis going from thousands of dollars a pound down to hundreds, bankrupting small farmers, destroying a way of life and culture. Soon, all the high-end clothing stores would shutter, the sidewalk cafes would close, bookstores disappear, the movie theaters shutting down and just rotting there, the letters sadly falling off the dirty marquee. Even the Blue Room Bar and Calico's Cafe, which had been iconic Garberville staples for decades, closed. The streets that had been full of trimmigants, hippies, and rich pot growers, going empty, as folks left in droves, heading to places like Oregon that had less restrictions, or giving up on the lifestyle altogether and moving to cities to test their luck there.
I ain't the sinner that I used to be. Hey, 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 I'll sit before judgment with a guilty plea.
But at the Branding Iron in 2016, it was a wild night. Drinks were flowing, the pool tables had a line to play, and Zach, Giggles, and Cricket were sitting in a corner booth, whispering through a haze of LSD, alcohol, and Valium of their desire to kill that ripoff Jesus Jeff, who was sitting on the fruits of all their labors. It wasn't fair. They'd grown the weed, done all the work.
The next day, they took off for Laytonville, going to Wheels Cafe where they continued to drink. Then they finally get a text from Jesus Jeff saying, unfortunately, they'd have to wait a few more days to get paid. And until then, he didn't want them coming back to the land. And now they're really pissed and wondering if they were ever going to get paid.
Michael Caine was also waiting for money from Jesus Jeff, so Zach calls him as well, and they meet up, forming a posse to go up into the hills and take what's owed to them.
They're eating more acid, and it's getting weirder. Cricket then tells Giggles that big-time acid dealers are also pissed off at Jesus Jeff, which, I don't know, that may just be some kind of crazy delusion, especially as Cricket would later say he was tripping so hard he didn't even know what was happening, thought he was in a movie or something. Then Michael starts saying the operation had been green-lighted by town elders, which is very intriguing.
Yes, Michael tells Giggles a higher up in the underground cannabis market, an old schooler, has given them the green light to kill Jeff, pointing out a mysterious old man. But who is this mysterious old man? We'll find out, dear listeners.
Chapter 8. The Murder. Now, there are many, many different versions of what went down that night. And one of them is from a guy who got all wrapped up in it, but claims he was completely innocent. Didn't even know the murder had happened. This guy's name is Jesse Wells.
According to Jesse Wells, he had nothing to do with any of it. He claims he had no truck with Jesus Jeff. He didn't owe him anything. Jesse says he had his own grow and was innocently sitting in a hotel room in Laytonville trimming his own weed when Michael and Zach showed up asking for a ride up the hill to get their stuff.
Jesse says he told them no, he didn't want anything to do with their weird bullshit drama. But Zach persisted, saying Michael had talked to the owner, the old man Lou, and he'd given them permission to go up there and get their stuff.
So Jesse says he reluctantly agreed, but only drove them to the gate, then waited in the car for them.
Jesse says about 6 minutes later, Amanda came driving down with her son, but when he went to talk to her, she refused to speak to him and just sat there with a crazed, stubborn look in her eyes. And then Zach came strutting down the road, and Jesse says he asked him, "Yo, Zach, what's going on?"
And Zach replied, "Nothing, it's all good."
"Well, what's up with that girl and her kid? What's her fucking problem? She's acting weird as hell."
And Zach said, "She's been physically, mentally, and psychically abused by drugs."
Jesse says he just shrugged his shoulders and drove off back to the cottages, thinking nothing of it.
In the morning, when the body was found, the cops came to Jesse's room, searching for anything linking him to the murder, including stolen items or weed.
They found nothing. And Jesse says there's surveillance footage of him leaving the parking lot of the motel, then coming back completely alone and innocently going back to his room.
But the Mendocino Sheriff's Office claims that the video footage shows Jesse returning with a car full of people, most likely Giggles and Cricket. Unfortunately, this video surveillance has been lost by the Sheriff's Department.
But with no evidence linking him to the murder, the cops let him go, and he packed up his stuff and took off for Lake Tahoe.
But according to Zach Wooster, who gave a detailed confession to the police, when they went to Jesse's room, he was all about robbing Jesus Jeff and egged them on, psyched them up, saying he knew for a fact that Jesus Jeff had just done a big pot deal and was sitting on a pile of money.
Zach claims Jesse offered to help them, saying he personally wanted to kick Jeff's ass and brought the bolt cutters to cut the lock on the gate. So, Zach claims that he was armed with a taser, Cricket with a knife, and Michael was double-fisted, holding a hatchet in one hand and a knife in the other as they crept through the darkness to the little cabin.
Giggles knocks on the door, and Amanda opens it, and when Jeff sees them, he comes out barefoot and irate, begins to put his boots on, yelling and screaming. When he sees Jesse is with them, he berates him, asking him what the fuck he was doing there. He had nothing to do with any of it.
According to Zach, his old friend Michael, he knew from EDM festivals in New Jersey, then attacked with the hatchet, and Jesus Jeff tumbled to the ground. Zach says at this point he was outside the cabin, just watching. And then Amanda started screaming, "Please don't hurt me! Please don't hurt my son," running outside, where Zach tried to calm her, as Michael, Jesse, and Cricket then dragged Jeff into the cabin, punching, kicking, and stabbing him. And Michael then put his knee on Jeff's chest and said, "This is for selling bad acid," before slowly sinking the knife into Jesus Jeff's throat. Jeff's last words, simply, "No, no, no."
According to Cricket, the story is slightly different. Cricket claims he was just there to be an intermediary for Zach and Michael, a negotiator. He was the elder of the crew, and it was him who knocked on the door. Amanda answered, then Jeff came forward, and Cricket says he looked at Jeff and stated,
"Hey, come on, Jesus. You owe these guys money. Well, let's just take care of it."
And Cricket claims that it was Zach who came out from nowhere and hit Jeff in the head with the hatchet, instigating the killing, followed by Michael, who stabbed Jeff, and then Cricket said he just jumped into the melee and started blindly stabbing, cutting open his own hand in the process.
Cricket also claims that part of the plan was to steal the rock of crystal LSD Jesus Jeff kept in his backpack. And interestingly, Zach would tell police that he had taken a backpack from the crime scene.
But Cricket later said he was tripping so hard it was like scenes from a movie, and that he didn't really know what was going on.
And further complicating things, Michael Caine claims it was in fact him who attacked Jeff with the hatchet, but he did it to protect Cricket, because Jesus Jeff came out swinging and attacked them first. It was all some kind of self-defense, but he denies being the one to stick the knife into Jeff's throat, saying that it was actually Cricket who had done that.
Either way, as Zach tries to calm Amanda down, Giggles and Cricket start grabbing the bins of weed and loading them into Amanda's car.
And Michael Caine, it appears committing murder had broken Michael Caine in some way, cracked and damaged his psyche, because he just wanders away.
He never asks for his cut of the money, weed or acid, doesn't help load the totes, doesn't even get in the car with them as they make their escape. He just staggers off, zombie-like, walks down the road, all the way to Highway 101. And as the sun rises, he holds out his thumb and begins hitchhiking south. going south, 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 through the redwoods and into the Great Valley, over the Grapevine and into San Fernando, past Hollywood and Los Angeles, San Diego, and to the Mexican border, where he keeps on going into Mexico, seemingly in a daze.
It's just so fucking weird, isn't it?
Yeah, it's definitely a strange response. Chapter 9, The Great Escape. The big question would become, what did Amanda know? What did Amanda do? Remember, there's rumors that both Zach and Jesus are sleeping with Amanda. Was it a doomed love triangle? Could jealousy be at play?
Everyone seems to agree it was Amanda who answered the door that night. That's one part of all the stories that stays consistent. And that she then just stepped outside, leaving her 4-year-old son in the house.
Some say this proves that she didn't know what was going to happen, for she never would have left her child in a room where a man was about to get murdered.
And if she would, she definitely wins the Bad Mom of the Year award. But let's face it, she gets Bad Mom of the Year award just for having her kid in that shithole.
It's also a fact that Amanda then drove the rest of them off in her car. But was it voluntary?
But this sad crew of desperados had no loyalty to each other. They were no Bonnie and Clyde, no Barker clan, or even a Manson family. For they soon split up, headed out in different directions.
Apparently, it was all too much for Zach. Just days later, he turned himself in to the police in Willits, a town just south of Laytonville, on the 16th of November.
Giggles was next, turning himself into sheriffs in Ukiah on November 25th.
3 days later, Amanda contacted law enforcement via a lawyer, claiming she was kidnapped and in fear for both her life and her 4-year-old sons. The lawyer arranged a meeting between Amanda, prosecutors, and sheriff's detectives, and she was reclassified as a kidnapping victim and set free, prosecutors saying, quote, "What we learned since her interview was she did not leave of her own free will."
And in the most bizarre incident, in January of 2017, Michael Caine, the raver with the stubby blonde dreadlocks, who sank his knife into Jesus' throat and then just wandered away in a daze and began hitchhiking south into Mexico, apparently having broken his psyche with murder. He went to the Border Patrol and told them he had information on a strange plot to assassinate President Trump involving LSD dealers and outlaw bikers. It appears he had gone into full-blown psychosis or something. They ran his name and quickly discovered he had a felony warrant for murder.
They were all talking and also pointing the finger at Jesse Wells, who, remember, claimed complete ignorance of the murder, saying he'd just given them a ride, and after being questioned by police, took off to Lake Tahoe. In February, he was rounded up there in Tahoe and hauled in as well.
Also in February, Freddie, the wild-eyed guy with a mohawk, whose only real involvement appears to be loaning Zach his car, was discovered hiding out in an abandoned house in New Jersey.
And finally, Cricket, the last of the idiot outlaws who'd made it on the run the longest, was ratted out and picked up in Red Bank, New Jersey on March 10th, 2017.
Well, it was in my childhood days, oh Lord, many long years ago. Now with the spirit.
Chapter 10, Sentencing.
I was filled, not filled, oh, in that old anything.
Prosecutors attempted to use the old felony murder law that we talked about last week on our Hunter S. Thompson case. If you didn't hear that case, go listen. The felony murder law is an archaic law brought here from Britain that says anyone involved with a felony before a murder, such as robbery, is guilty of that murder, even if they did not commit it or cause it.
Prosecutors were hoping to use the harsh law as a means of leverage to force Zach and Giggles to testify against Michael and Cricket. But then Governor Jerry Brown, the day before the trial was to begin, signed a bill ending the felony murder law in California.
Which, it's a good thing, for although this law could be used for good in theory, it was always terribly abused by both prosecutors and police.
So Michael, Zach, Giggles, and Jesse all took plea deals. Michael and Zach were sentenced to 14 years for voluntary manslaughter. Jesse and Giggles pleaded guilty to robbery and were given 3-year sentences.
But old Cricket, the old-timer farmer, he still ended up going to trial, where he pleaded innocent, saying he was tripping so hard on acid that he was only stabbing hallucinations in his own hand. But a jury found him guilty, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the chance of parole, taking the brunt of justice for the murder of Jesus Jeff.
But that's not the end of it, dear listeners. Oh no, it gets even crazier.
Chapter 11, The Green Light. Remember the mystery man whom Giggles said Michael had pointed out to him, saying he'd given them the green light to murder Jesus Jeff? Well, it turns out that this was supposedly none other than Louis Baglier, a disabled combat veteran who owned the land.
According to Michael, he'd gone to Baglier and complained about Jesus Jeff not paying anybody, saying everybody was ready to kill him. And supposedly the old man had said, "Go ahead, kill him, I give you the green light," and then told Michael that he could use the land to grow on the next year.
But the sheriffs blew this rumor off, saying it sounded ridiculous to give a green light to a murder without any preparation of what to do with the body, how to dispose of it. No plan, no strategy, just chaos. It sounded far-fetched at best.
Journalist Sam Anderson was able to contact Old Man Lou by phone, asking about the rumors. And Lou stated,
It don't matter. I'm the most scandalous motherfucker you ever met, bitch.
Lewis then bragged to Anderson about having millions of dollars stashed, and then said he had to go, as he was apparently in the middle of a large pot deal.
Then, in the fall of 2020, a new group of hippies was on Lou's land growing weed. And at harvest, a group of masked, armed men pull up in a van, gathering everyone up at gunpoint, demanding their cash and stealing over 20 pounds of trimmed weed.
Then, 2 weeks later, the thieves showed back up, demanding more money, more weed, before taking off in a van. But the growers had alerted the sheriffs, who cut the van off at the end of the road. They opened the door to the van, and there was Lou Baglier, his son Tyler, and 4 tough guys from Oakland.
Fucking crazy, man. So they were all arrested for armed robbery and assault. The hired toughs from Oakland landed in state prison for 3 to 5 years. But not Lou, the old combat veteran who most likely gave the green light to the murder of Jesus Jeff. He got out on bail for medical reasons and promptly fled, probably with the $1 million he bragged of having buried in the hills. To this day, no one knows where Louis Baglier went.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of the murder of Jesus Jeff and the fall of the Emerald Triangle. We hope you enjoyed it.
I want to thank all the bands who let us feature their music in this episode, including some iconic Southern Humboldt musicians.
legendary environmentalist and earth firster Daryl Cherney, the utterly classic Raw Deal and the Ideals, and the incredible Wayne Stark and the Camo Cowboys, and my good friend Harlan Rollins, whose wedding at the hog farm I mentioned, and his band, the Abalonians. We also had show favorites Halizna, as well as Keshko and Laura Sheeran. There's links in the show notes to all their music. Check them out.
And if this case interests you, I recommend you check out the podcast Crooked City, Season 2, The Emerald Triangle. It's an amazing podcast. Every season they go to some town and through really great investigative work, uncover all kinds of crazy scandals. And in Season 2, they went to Laytonville. And that podcast was one of the main sources for this episode.
Thanks again for listening, and be safe out there.
And you want to tell us something? You got any more information about this? Did we get something wrong? It can happen. Let us know. Drop us a line at murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. Let us know if you've got a story you'd like us to cover. And hey, if you got a band and you want your music featured, let us know. Thanks so much for listening, everybody. We will check you out later.